Welcome to the Forestry England podcast. My name's Bex, and I'm travelling up and down the country visiting some of the nation's most beautiful forests. Plus, I'm unearthing some surprising stories along the way. This week, we're going wild. We're in Dalby Forest in Yorkshire chatting to Gareth, all about the creepy crawlies, critters and other creatures that call the forest home.
This sort of disturbed habitat, it does look quite dramatic, but there's things like nightjar that really rely on having this, things like adders, and they really need this sort of habitat that only gets created by removing trees.
And we're chatting to Ed from NatureSpy and Rachel from Forestry England all about pine marten.
Pine marten is around about the size of a cat, and they have an amazing ability to climb trees because their hind paws can rotate 180 degrees like a squirrel.
Plus, our producer Adam is taking us ultrasonic.
Yes, we're finding out about the symphony of forest sounds that you and I can't hear. What animal do you think makes this sound?
All right, we'll find out later on. First, let's say hello to Gareth. He's in charge of managing Forestry England sites in Yorkshire. So after shaking hands at Dalby Forest's massive and very impressive visitor centre, we jumped in the car and we went up to an area of the forest that most people, bar probably mountain bikers and extreme ramblers, might not visit. Gareth has a wealth of knowledge, he's super passionate about the environment and ecology, and as we were chatting, snow actually started to fall around us, it was pretty cold, and we stood in a clearing just off the side of the road. But I was a bit confused about this because, well, of course, we're there to record an episode about nature and wildlife, and what Gareth was showing me was basically an area with 0 trees.
I was just looking around us here, because Dalby's so big, we don't have to grow trees everywhere. And actually, it sounds weird, but a lot of forest animals don't always want wall-to-wall trees. Mm-hmm. And if you think about forests, we always think about that, but actually forests were always meant to be sort of spaces where you'd have areas of woodland, open areas where you get sunlight and woodland butterflies coming in, and woodland plants, and then you'd have sort of damp areas where you'd get ferns and things like that. So they're always meant to be this sort of quite diverse sort of mosaics. And that's what forests really should be. If you look around us here, we do have patches of areas where we're growing trees for timber. Mm-hmm. We have areas of native trees which are growing. We have areas where you've got heathland coming through, these sort of rushes down here, which is a wetter area, probably not at the moment because it's a bit chilly, but that would be damp and you'd get things like frogs and amphibians. And then over there where we're growing trees again, we're starting to introduce much more a greater diversity of trees, so we're trying to think about climate resilience because some species need specific trees, other species like birds in particular just need somewhere to nest, and so the greater diversity we can bring in, the more species are supported, but also because climate change is a bit unknown about the impacts of it, the higher the chances are that some of those trees can survive to become the mature big trees of the future.
So we are standing here. It's snowing today. We're standing in a cold winter's day, but it's kind of like bright and beautiful. But like you said before, there's quite an interesting landscape in front of us. Can you tell everybody listening like what we can see?
So what you can see is what some people would feel like it looks a bit devastating. So it's an area where woodlands that's been grown for timber has been felled. I think you can see in the background you've got some trees that have sort of fallen over and been hung up by the wind. So we've had very strong wind events, various storms over the last few months have blown things over. But that's sort of what we would have planted in the sort of 40s and 50s and 60s as Forestry England, growing timber for the market to make sure we've got sustainable timber for the UK. And as that's been felled, it does look sort of quite bleak. But what it does do, you can see as soon as something is unlocked, the stuff that's been sitting there in the seed bank comes through. So we've got rushes over here, we've got heather over there, we've got various heathland plants popping through. And this sort of disturbed habitat, it does look quite dramatic.
Yeah, it does, yeah.
There's things like nightjar that really rely on having this, things like adders, and they really need this sort of habitat that only gets created by removing trees.
Right, so maybe, it looks kind of, like you say, it does look a bit bleak because you can just see lots of tree stumps and it looks like everything's been felled. But actually, for some animals and creatures, it's like, happy days, we can move in now. Yeah,
it's created the habitat that they need. And I think naturally what this would have happened is you'd have had forests would have grown and you'd have got wind would have created this. We'd have had very large herbivores, things like elephant size that had pushed over trees. We haven't got those things anymore. So I guess what we really do is, Forestry England, is we recreate some of the processes are missing. So trees naturally should fall over through, in America it's through wildfires, that's how you get tree areas. For us it's through windfall, and we haven't got some of the things that do that. So we intervene, we fell trees, yes, we sell them for timber to make it sustainable, but where we leave them, that creates the habitat for the things that actually need open forest space.
So how do you pick which areas to kind of focus on or not focus on or let go, basically?
Yeah, that's a good question. I probably sit on the line, and this is where people into wildlife sit on different areas. I'm more of the line of nature will sort of find the right balance if you just make it unable to do that. So I think the way I sort of think about it, like this wildlife, it's an ecosystem. What's an ecosystem? It's a machine. So it's really like a big collected brain, nature. It's got lots of different things. They're all connected. They're all working together. Now, if one thing breaks or isn't quite working properly, it can affect lots of other different things. So I see our job as Forestry England is to try and fix the machine, get it working again, and then that will basically work itself out in the landscape as to where nature wants to be. But our things are things like making sure water's flowing properly, making sure that soil's healthy, making sure we've got things like soil fungi, which play a massive role in all of this. Those populations are healthy. So we do that part, to sort of fix the natural processes, and then the things that come and arrive will come naturally.
It must be hard because you don't want to kind of get involved too much, right? You want nature to find its own way, but you also want to help it out a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that this is where the term sort of forest wilding comes in, and I think there's different. You can do very passive wilding, or you can do active wilding. I think we're sort of more in the sort of active wilding, so we like to give sort of nature a bit of a hands up, get them going, and then gradually step back as we see these sort of natural processes, which would have always happened over hundreds of thousands of millions of years, would have been the way that you'd got diversity in nature anyway. But unfortunately, a lot of those processes have been lost by the way we've, as a nation, we've managed the land, and we're trying to reverse some of that in our forests.
So what exactly is forest wilding for people who don't know?
So what is forest? So, I mean, there's three parts of it. One is us trying to look at the really special areas that have got very rare wildlife and to make sure that we're looking after those properly. Another part is about these big core wild areas, so where we're going to really manage with nature in mind first. And that's where we're looking at things like restoring the way the water moves around the country, the landscape. We're looking at bringing back species that play a really important role. And that links to the third part of forest wilding, which is about reintroduction of species. Now, it's not just bringing back any species, it's thinking about the ones that, and we use the word sort of keystones or things like that. So the species that have such a big part in their ecosystem that their presence affects the presence or absence of lots of other species. So an example is pine marten. Carnivores are often keystone species because they help to keep other species in check. So it's a weird thing really, but you'll get a greater diversity of prey species if you have carnivores there because they stop one prey species out competing the other one.
Right, okay, so it is that fine line of just making everything balance out basically.
It's balanced away, but it's never properly a balance. It's sort of, it's dynamic in a way. So it's constantly moving, it's like oscillating, going up and down, up and down. But if you move the checks and balances, what you get is you lose that up and down. It just goes one way or the other.
Yeah.
I think at the moment, what we don't want to do is start reintroducing stuff because the main thing is to get the habitat and the ecosystem right. And then a lot of things will turn up of their own accord. You've got to reintroducing stuff comes with a lot of responsibility. So we want to make sure that when we do it, it's well thought through and it's absolutely necessary.
So yeah, it naturally comes back on its own and you're just kind of giving it a slight helping hand, basically.
Yeah, and if there's stuff that we think is important and that should be in Dalby and was in Dalby and doesn't come back of its own accord, then we'll think about giving it a helping hand. But you've got to make sure you do that in the right way.
Because obviously from the northeast it does tend to enlarge, the snow very rarely.
We can have a little wander down this forest track and then we can see something a bit different and then...
It's quite nice to see it in the snow, isn't it? Yeah. So many creatures underfoot. Oh, wow. God, that is like so dark in there, isn't it?
Yeah, you can see the different, actually quite nice like contrast of like how dark it is and what lives, like, how little's living on the floor.
Yeah.
And so over there where, I know it's brambles, but brambles are great for loads of things. And you can see the difference, like letting light in makes, which is why like you need, most things in a forest will live like on the edge. Like the transition area, it's called ecotone, but that's where you get the most diversity, where one sort of bit moves to the other, and if you can soften it. Yeah. So this here, it's quite sharp here, it's like trees, road, that.
Yeah, it's pretty like kind of exact, isn't it? Because you look in there, it looks so dark, you can, the snow isn't getting in through there. Yeah. Almost. But here, you've got a bit more diversity, I imagine.
Exactly. So the idea is we want to soften these edges over time.
Oh, I see. So make it like a little easier for animals and creatures and wildlife to come back.
But this is more the wild core areas will look like. It's a bit more like rewilded, where you'd get like trees, you'd get blocks of trees, and then you'd get open areas and you get heathland and grassland.
So what would there be any wildlife in here, like living around here?
So I guess there would be wildlife around here. So you get a lot of birds. Unfortunately, you see they'd be quite high up in the trees, but you'd probably get like quite a lot of the tit family. You get goldcrests and things. In fact, that was one calling just there, but it's probably too far away. The other thing we do get a lot of in here is deer, which is it's always lovely to see deer. It's also quite a challenge when you're trying to grow trees. So deer are something that part of our native fauna. but they don't have a native predator that's left in Britain. So it's another thing that we have to sort of reenact as part of Forestry England. So deer, they do perform an important process in terms of spreading seeds around and grazing, but because there's nothing keeps their numbers in check, they actually damage quite a lot of trees. So when we're trying to grow sort of new woodlands or restore native ancient woodlands, that can be hindered by having too many deer. And they'll hide up in forests like this. You'll get owls as well. You should get tawny owls. This is the sort of stuff that pine martens would be found in, like quite dense canopy forests as well. And abundant squirrels sometimes, but...
Abundant squirrels, that's a good phrase.
Yeah.
I can imagine many people listening are like, yes, we have seen many, many squirrels in the forests. It's great. It's very atmospheric, isn't it?
But what you can see is it's quite dark.
Yeah.
And not a lot of light comes through. So what that favours is things like mosses and lichens and ferns and things like that. You can see a few here, where if you look at just the other side of the road, you just see outside the forest, and suddenly where the light's in, there's much greater diversity of plants. And generally speaking, where you get more plants, you get more insects, you get more birds, you get more everything else. So where we're growing productive timber, it's really good for some species, but you get a much greater diversity of species benefit where there's light, and particularly that transition from the sort of dense canopy to the light, because that's a nice safe zone, because you can sort of go out, there'll be more food available in the light area, but there's a nice shelter and refuge of coming back into the forest.
It's like the best of all of the worlds. Yeah. Do you have quite a big team working on this then?
Not a huge team really. I mean, we only have two ecologists in the district.
Oh, right.
And what we try to do is we have people who manage the timber and the trees, and we try to think about the way we plan for our forests, that everyone really plays a role in it as well. And it's difficult because you're trying to balance up different things. And sometimes it's not always the thing that's best for wildlife, it's the thing that's best for timber, that's the best thing for people, and you've got to sort of balance up those decisions. I think, naturally I'm an ecologist, so I always try to put what's for ecology best first. But
yeah, you've got to have all of the things at once, I suppose. I think we focus so much on people using the forest, which is lovely, but you forget the forests were never really here for us in the first place. They're here for many more things than just humans. Now, in a moment, we're going to chat to Ed from NatureSpy and Rachel from Forestry England all about nature recovery and how some pretty high-tech gear is being used to snap pictures of pine martens. But before that, it's a good time to remind you that if you do love immersing yourself in the sounds of nature, then why not consider a Forestry England membership? Well, membership is, of course, an amazing way to have a regular, great day out for the whole family in forests all over the country. It's also a really great way of supporting people like Gareth and the team at Forestry England as they beaver away to help England's precious wildlife thrive in what are some pretty challenging circumstances. Find out how you too can support the future of our incredible native wildlife by becoming a Forestry England member at the end of this podcast. Now, our producer Adam is back in his studio cum laboratory. I mean, just imagine there's wires and microphones and speakers and other noise-making things everywhere, and he's promising to make us hear the unheard.
Dalby is home to tons of wildlife. Pause for a moment and you'll hear birds. You might hear a fluffle of rabbits hopping in the hedges, and in the summer, perhaps even some grasshoppers and crickets. But there's a whole world of sound that you and I can't hear. But using some super sensitive microphones and a touch of magic, we can extend the human hearing range far beyond the norm. What you're hearing now is ultrasonic. It's 5 times higher in frequency than the best of human hearing. Inaudible, invisible, in other words, to you and I. These sounds belong to a creature that's gotten a pretty tough rap these past few years. The sky is teeming with bats. They're unsung heroes. Without them, trees like the ones in Dalby would be infested with insects. These mammals come out at night to hunt. They emit ultrasonic pulses, and by listening to the echoes that bounce back, create a detailed mental map of their surroundings. It's called echolocation, and it's a system that enables bats to navigate through the night sky, detect tiny insects, and avoid obstacles, like trees. And it makes you think, doesn't it? Human hearing is about 20 to 20,000 hertz. So, what else is around us that we can't hear?
I was there, by the way, as Adam was recording that, and those bats were actually flying overhead, and he had his microphone up in the air like a kind of child holding a trophy. It was really quite impressive to watch. But from the forest skies to the forest floor, we're about to find out about another incredible animal, and tech plays a huge role here too. So let's hear from Rachel. She sits on the planning and environment team nationally at Forestry England, and Ed from NatureSpy, who create camera traps. They're small boxes strapped to the trees that snap pictures and videos of anything that gets in their path. We began by chatting a little bit about the partnership.
Yeah, so we've been working in partnership with Forestry England in Yorkshire for quite a number of years now. We're coming on for 10 years. And we're particularly interested in pine martens in Yorkshire. We've been researching their presence and running things like a den box programme for a number of years now.
So yeah, I have been to Dalby Forest in Yorkshire and I heard about pine martens. For anybody who doesn't know much about them, what are the basics? What should we know about a pine marten?
So what is a pine marten? So pine martens are in the mustelid family, and that's alongside otters, badgers, stoats and weasels. Pine martens are generally, they are an arboreal species. They spend a lot of time in trees. So trees are important for them as a safe place for refuge. So they den in trees, they raise their young in trees, but they use a whole mosaic of habitats as well. They have a distinctive creamy yellow patch of fur on their chest that runs down onto their legs. And this is really useful for us because it means we can differentiate between individual pine martens.
Oh, that's very handy. I like that, like a little badge that they have, basically.
Exactly, yeah.
I love it. So, Rachel, tell me, you're working kind of on a national level with Forestry England and nature recovery. So what does that mean for pine martens?
Yeah, so we're really excited to see pine marten recovery actually in quite a number of our forest areas. So we monitor pine marten, as Ed mentioned, in Yorkshire, also up in Kielder Forest in Northumberland. We've also been involved in the Forest of Dean pine marten reintroduction, which is now in its post-release monitoring stage. And we're just really excited to see this incredibly charismatic species back, not only in its own right, but it has a really positive impact in sort of restoring that ecosystem balance, that ecosystem function, right across the sort of species assemblage that you see in our woodlands. And where pine marten are doing well, it generally means that there's a lot of positive things going on around them too. So around things like habitat connectivity, diversity of both tree species and other wildlife species as well.
So tell me, why did their numbers go down in the first place? Do we know? Yeah,
so unfortunately, pine marten, along with a number of other sort of what we call mesopredators, so sort of middle-sized predators, they suffered quite a lot due to persecution in the sort of 18th, 19th century, and also a huge amount of habitat loss and fragmentation just meant that they couldn't keep as high a number as they need to keep a good population going, and they couldn't move around the landscape as they need to.
I see. So how has Forestry England been helping them recover? Is it about looking at the environment and the habitat and trying to kind of make it more habitable for them?
Yeah, so it's about a number of things. So there's a huge drive at the moment to think about habitats in terms of bigger, better and more connected. So we want our habitats to be covering larger areas. So as the nation's forests, we cover sort of 250,000 hectares. So we're the largest land manager in England. So it gives us a huge potential to help species like the pine marten, just in terms of the quantity of land we have. We want these habitats to be better in terms of the diversity of both tree and wildlife species they support. So that sort of function, all those natural processes that should be taking place are happening, right down from the soil communities all the way through to species like the pine marten, fungi communities, flora, reptiles, amphibians, birds, literally every species you can think of, enabling all of those to function as they should be. And then that connectivity I mentioned. So enabling species to move around the landscape as they need to, either through sort of stepping stones of habitat or through proper corridors. So things like good hedgerows, copses, really, really important in sort of making that happen. And through our work at Forestry England, we really hope that we can help restore those sorts of habitats for species like this.
So, Rachel, you're kind of looking at it from a national level, and then Ed, am I right in thinking you've been involved in a kind of more local level? So, for example, in Yorkshire, you've been involved in a pine marten project in there.
Absolutely, yeah. And just to build on what Rachel mentioned there about the habitats, one thing that we can do in the short term is install artificial den boxes for pine martens. So typically a lot of forests in this country lack those natural denning opportunities that pine martens would usually find in older woodlands. So we install specially made pine marten den boxes. So this immediately gives a boost in that habitat quality for them. So they've got safe places to rest and sleep, safe places to raise their young.
And what kind of stuff have you been doing with the cameras as well? Have you been like keeping a track of them?
Absolutely, yes. That's a big part of our work. We've been running camera trap surveys going back to 2013 in the area. We started on a very small scale, and once we started to get images of pine martens in the area in 2017, we scaled up our efforts. So we're now using around about 50 cameras at any given time, and we use those in a couple of different ways. So we monitor some of the den boxes to understand what's happening at those. We also run baited camera sites as well. We put a variety of different foods in front of the camera to bring martens in if they're in the area. So this helps us to understand whether or not they're there. We can start to understand some of their behaviours around things like the den boxes. We can, as I mentioned earlier, with the distinctive creamy yellow bib, we can identify individuals. So there's so much we can learn from the camera footage.
So you've been capturing some pictures of them and some clips. What's your favourite clip that you found?
Ed, what's the one where it's kind of playing around the entrance of the den box and then sort of semi falls in? That one's quite entertaining. I can't remember which video that's on.
Is it quite close up? Is it one of the black den boxes, one of the kind of barrel ones?
Possibly. Is it the pine marten exploring a den box one?
Might be the second one on the list. Yeah, so a recent one, pine marten exploring a den box in Yorkshire. So they do some interesting things when they approach the den boxes to begin with. And this is a sequence of clips that are all caught on one camera that kind of show how they approach them in a kind of cautious way.
Yeah, it's absolutely brilliant. I love that clip.
I can totally imagine them being quite cautious. Yeah, Rachel, have you seen some good clips of them as well?
Yeah, they're just so inquisitive, just clearly very sort of curious as they approach somewhere that obviously looks like it could be of interest to them, just sort of sniffing around and standing up on their back legs and a slightly meerkat appearance, and finally decide it's sort of worth exploring, and just sort of climb inside and sort of, yeah, just tail hanging out the bottom, sort of drifting around for a bit. No, they're brilliant. They're absolutely fantastic, really charismatic.
It's amazing. It's just so lovely to hear that like they're coming back, and that I guess it's good for you guys because you can see that, you know, the nature recovery is working, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It's we're dealing with very small numbers, but certainly in the last 3-4 years, we're picking up a lot more activity than we were in prior years.
And Rachel, for Forestry England, this must be a really useful kind of source to see what's happening as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It gives us a really good indicator of, you know, how we best support the species going forward. So learning that den boxes are a real help in terms of monitoring is fantastic, just to get that sort of information from such detailed surveys over such a long period. We've had work undertaken of a similar sort of camera trapping nature down in the New Forest recently, at a pine marten population that we're seeing more widely distributed across the landscape there as well. And this kind of technology is just absolutely fantastic at enabling us to get into that secret life of animals like this and understand how they're using the habitat and how we can best support their recovery.
And you mentioned as well, it's obviously not just pine martens that you guys are looking at, it's all kind of animals and flora and fauna. This seems like a lot of stuff to focus on, Rachel.
Yeah, it's a huge amount of diversity that we'd like to see recover, obviously, to our landscapes. We're one of the sort of most nature depleted countries in the world, really, here in England. So it's really important that we just try and rebuild some of that resilience, because it's through our biodiversity that, you know, a lot of the other challenges that we face in the light of things like climate change can be addressed. So understanding what might be missing and helping restore that can really help us as a species as well going forward in our place within the natural world.
We're obviously very interested in pine martens, but we don't get to choose which wildlife visits our cameras. And we refer to this as bycatch, but it's a good kind of bycatch because it means we get to see loads of wildlife. And there's over 60 different species that we've recorded on our cameras in the Yorkshire area, alongside pine martens.
And how do you know when it's actually worked, when nature recovery has worked? Is that when you see creatures like pine martens coming back, or is there something specific you notice and you think, oh, okay, it's all coming together?
I think when you see a population sort of recover to a point where you're not having to sort of interfere, they are just doing their thing, and then you see the knock-on impacts of that. So you start to see other species that you wouldn't have expected in that space are actually recovering alongside them. And that, you know, those kind of what we like to call ecosystem engineers and keystone species, those knock-on impacts, when you start to see those and you go, wow, that's it. That's the excitement. That's the feeling that, you know, you've kicked that ball rolling, but everything else is then just taking place exactly as it should.
I really enjoyed talking to Ed and Rachel, and I have to confess, I literally had no idea how big a pine marten was. I mean, cat-sized, absolutely huge. Now, listening to these experts, I was really struck by the challenge that they face balancing all three core aspects of the forest: trees, people, and wildlife. Thanks for listening to the Forestry England podcast. This episode was all about ecology. It was produced and edited by Adam Stoner, with help from Rebecca Small. Research by Kieran Snedden and Dominic Head. My name is Bex Lindsay. Next week, we're heading to Thetford Forest in Suffolk, where we'll meet Ellie. She's going to be telling us all about forest planning.
The best way that I've had it described to me is it's a bit like sitting in the middle of a spider's web. You have all these different threads that are pulling on your attention, that you're trying to balance.
Bats and spiders in one episode. We're still a while away from Halloween. If you've loved this podcast, why not take out a Forestry England membership? Whether you're looking to smash that couch to 5k routine or just want somewhere incredible to take the kids on the weekends, there's literally no place like the forest. A membership is such a good way to support the amazing work that Forestry England do to care for the nation's forests. Their future is our future too. You can find out more about membership at forestryengland.uk. And check out the show notes for a whole host of information on different ways that you can spend your weekend in the great green outdoors. See you soon.